We've got a few that are out this morning. Greg and his family are all traveling, and he asked me to take this class. Probably forgot some of the most important things this morning, which makes it a little difficult. So might be calling on a few people to help me read a few things this morning. The phone works pretty good. I can make it brighter and see, but the light right over me makes it a little bit, unless somebody has an extra pair of reading glasses that I could borrow for a few minutes. But we've been studying in the book of Hebrews. We've been looking at a lot of things. I think the theme through the book of Hebrews is what? A better way. A lot of times we as consumers take and might subscribe to a magazine called Consumer Reports. What does Consumer Reports do? Doesn't it compare a bunch of different products? And it sort of lists them, from, if it has some some problems with it, it has some, issues, but it tries to go through and, say you're in the market for a new wash machine, and you're wanting to look at all the different brands out there, and it might go through and tell you this particular brand is so-so, this one's so-so, this one's a little better, but this is the best one. And then a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take that brand of wash machine and they'll compare it to its previous models and tell you all the improvements that have come through with it. We see the same thing with cars. A lot of, thank you. Appreciate that. Maybe we can, that helps a whole lot. Like I say, sometimes I just, I get up and put all the stuff together, and most of the time I don't need the glasses, but for some reason I get a little nervous and the lighting's not quite right. I can't see very well. But we'll work through this. But and we go through and look at our car manufacturers. We've got a number of people here that work in the car industry, Matt and Mark and Bob, they all work there. And we see, they go through and they get a number of things that show, okay, this is the improvements that we're making to this vehicle over last year. We made it, quote, better. Sometimes that's a little questionable, but, that's the goal of the manufacturer, to improve it. And when we look at here in the book of Hebrews, here was a situation that these people came out of Judaism. And what the writer's doing, he's going through and he's making a contrast with a number of different issues. We've seen that from chapter 1 through up to where we're going to work on this morning in chapter 9. And he's gone through and he's taken this one little part of it, he hints at it, and then he brings it out, and he says, well, here, this had this, but it was lacking. And this is better. Why are you wanting to go back to something that's not what it was, not what this new one is? And people, people could see this, and this is what the contrast is. We do that with a lot of things when we study things. We contrast the good with the bad, and we do it over and over again, and it helps us to understand why are we doing something this way? Because we try to do it better. And we go through here. And here in chapter 9, we've gone through and started, and one of the first things he starts talking about this covenant. There in verse 1 it says, now even the first covenant had regulations of divine worship and earthly sanctuary. So when he goes through and looks about that, this first covenant had what? It had regulations. What were some of these regulations? There were a whole list of them, right? When it was just talking about the worship, what did they have to do when they, particularly the priests? There was washings, there were sacrifices. The sacrifices had to be done in a certain way. They had to be presented in a certain way. Certain people had, certain of the priests had to, take in the sacrifices, had to prepare them, had to lay them on the altar, do all these different things to go through and be pleasing. But there's a little thing in there too, if it, the way the wording is written, it says, now even the first had regulations. What does that imply? The second does too. Sometimes we overlook that, right? He's not saying that this new covenant doesn't have regulations. And he's going to go through and he's going to sort of introduce some of these regulations, not really introduce them, but highlight them and talk to us about them a little bit. Some of them we just don't even really realize. Who did the initial regulations in the worship in the tabernacle? Who was responsible for that? The priest and the high priest. The high priest had certain duties, but the other priests that worked in and around the tabernacle had duties. There were ones that gathered the animals, ones that prepared the animals. They came through and they sacrificed them a certain way. They laid them on the altar. They took in the offerings. There was a lot of things, a lot of different regulations done. You just couldn't bring the animal, lead it up to the altar and sacrifice it. It had to go through a process. Not only that, but the sacrifice itself had to have what? What was the sacrifice?
Well, they had to be a certain type of animal, not injured or, perfect animal.
Right. So even the sacrifices themselves had regulations that went through to it. And this is what, the author of the book is trying to go through, especially here in chapter 9, that he's really emphasizing these type of things. And then he talks about the tabernacle. Had all these people that they were written to seen the inside of the Holy Holies? No. Hardly any of them. He described it. How did they know what was in it? How do you know what was inside the Holy of Holies? There were instructions. There were regulations that were given, what was supposed to be in there, how it was supposed to be arranged, where it went. So when he talks about this tabernacle, he talks about an outer tabernacle and the holy, these people started drawing a picture in their mind. All right? I had a friend in high school that, was an artist, and the way that they drew things is they'd read a paragraph or a little short story to them, and that type of artist was required to draw a picture of what was read to him. So, she could go through and do that, and it was her interpretation of what was read to it. But the interpretation is here, there's no doubt left to what was done. You go back into the law and you start reading about the direction and the intricacy and everything that went into this tabernacle. You could actually sit down and draw it out and measure it, go through and see what the loops and everything were, and set it up and make it like it was. All right? And that's what he's talking about here in these first few verses. He says, "Then for there was a tabernacle prepared, the outer one, in which were the lampstand, the table, the sacred bread, and this is called the holy place." All right? So that was something a lot of people could see. But mostly, who went into this holy place? Wasn't it all the priests that were doing services? How did, if you were a priest if you were a Levi called to be a priest, did you serve as that priest your whole life? Not talking about the high priest, but those priests that performed services. What was their duties? How often did they serve? Who were some of these priests that did service? Lineage of Levites, and then certain ones were appointed to that duty. And different priests had different jobs. One was lighting, burning the incense. Another one was maybe taking in the sacrifices. Others were, taking care of the lampstand, making sure that, it was lit and burning. All these different things that were going on that priests had duties to do. And he's starting to allude to this thing. Who are the priests in that new covenant that he's going to introduce here in a few minutes? Have you thought about that? Here you had all these priests that did the duties over in the first tabernacle, the first covenant. But who are the priests that are in the second covenant? We know who the high priest is. He's going to talk about that in a little bit. But who are the priests? Huh? It's us. So we have duties, right? Same as these duties over here. So we see these regulations. So it's not like, oh, we just come in and here's Christ, the high priest, and he does everything for us, and we just sit back on, on our pews or whatever, and we don't do anything. Hebrew writer's not saying that. He's saying there was regulations over there for the priest, for worship. There's regulations for us as well. And he goes through and he starts building this contrast that's coming up. He says there in verse 3, and behind the veil there was a tabernacle which is called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold, which was a golden jar holding the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded. And, here he's just painting a picture. You can start seeing this stuff. You knew what the tabernacle was. You knew where the Holy of Holies was. You could go back and read in the law and see how it was laid out. And you knew what things were supposed to be in it. So when he's talking to these, here's this picture being presented to these people that are reading here the book of Hebrews. They're starting to see, oh yeah, I know about that. That's the way we were brought up. We were taught that this was this, and this was here, and this was behind the veil, and then he goes on, and he says there in verse 5, and he goes on and gives that detail, and then he says, now when these things had been prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. So who's he talking about? He's talking about those priests. And it's not priest one, but he's talking about all the priests that are continually entering this outer tabernacle and continually performing divine worship. They had a purpose. That was their job. And that goes back to verse 1, that there was that divine worship at that time. And then he says, but the second only, the high priest enters once a year, not without taking blood, which is offered for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. So he goes through and he sort of separates basically what you call the order of priests. And he's starting to focus on one priest, the high priest. And that high priest had one duty explicitly that was supposed to be done. What was that duty? To enter that holy of holy place one time a year and make sacrifice and offerings for himself and for the people. All right? And then verse 8. What's your concept of verse 8? It says, the Holy Spirit signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed, while the outer tabernacle is still standing. From that verse here, what assumption can we make about the book of Hebrews? If that outer tabernacle was still standing, what can we say about Jerusalem in the book of Hebrews? Gives us sort of a time frame, right? We know that it was written before Jerusalem was destroyed, right? Because it states that the tabernacle was still standing. All right? So now he's starting to build a contrast. He's talking about entering this Holy of Holies by the high priest, and then he's talking about another place that was, from this second, tabernacle or covenant. And then he goes in verse 9, he says, verse 8, he says, the Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed, while the outer tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience. All right? So he's gone through and he's hinted at a new way, entering a different place that's, and this first place is just a symbol of what is to come, right? So he's sort of preparing something, right? If you know you're getting say, my wife's supposed to get a new wash machine this week. She's anticipating getting that new washing machine. She knows where her old one is. It sort of works, but she's been having to go down a laundromat. But she's really hoping for that one to come. The anticipation is there, but with everything going on, they say it's going to be there Thursday. But is it going to be there Thursday? Well, we could get a call Thursday morning. Oh, we're sorry the truck broke down. Oh, we're sorry the warehouse was out of stock. Oh, we're sorry the manufacturer didn't make enough. That anticipation can be put on hold, or we have to, keep waiting for it. When does that anticipation end? When the doorbell rings and the guy says, hey, I got your new washer out in my truck. Can I bring it in? All right. And what do you do? Well, you run and tell him, oh, yeah, I want it over here. Here's the laundry room. Okay, they make the preparation. They take out the old and they bring in the new, right? So he's going on that there in verse 8. In verse 9 says, and he says, this old tabernacle, which is a symbol of the present time, according to both gifts and sacrifices, and since they relate only to food and drink and various washings and regulations for the body, imposed until a time of Reformation. What does the word Reformation mean? Huh?
Something new is coming to replace, something's going to be changed.
Something's got to be changed, all right? When we look back at the, at the corruption that was in the church back in the, Dark Ages and things, there was a movement. What was that movement called? The Reformation Movement. What did the Reformation Movement do?
Catholic Church.
Tried to reform. It tried to change things, right? And we contrast that with what movement? Restoration movement. What's the difference between restoration and reform?
Restoration, you're trying to go back and restore something just like it was in the beginning. Where in reforming, you're just not necessarily going back to the beginning. You're just making changes.
Just making changes. Whether those changes are for the good or the bad, we don't know. There any car enthusiasts in here? I like sort of the 1950s car. If I could get a car that I really wanted, it would be a 1955 Chevy, two-door hardtop or convertible. All right? A lot of people go for the 57. I would go for the 55. Now, there's a difference. I'm really not looking for a restored 55 Chevy convertible or two-door hardtop. All right? I mean, it's nice. It would really look good. I wouldn't turn it down if somebody gave it. But I would probably want what they called a, sort of a reformed or a retrofit 55 Chevy. All right? I would want the new LS engine in it, an i6-speed or 8-speed automatic transmission, air conditioning, disc brakes, power steering, maybe a new different type suspension underneath it, and a good, clear flow exhaust system, and maybe a digital dashboard. And all. Is that really a 1955 Chevy? It's a 55 body, on something new. It's retrofitted. It's reformed. It's changed. It's not what it was. What they're talking about is, here is this one is old and waxed and worn out, and there's a new covenant. Now he goes on here in the next few verses to go through and makes a contrast to this, and he's starting to bring Christ into there. There in verse 10, he says, now, he says this first in verse 9 which is a symbol for the present time, according to the gifts and sacrifices, since they cannot make a worshiper perfect. So the old couldn't make a worshiper perfect, could it? It was something that was in there that was sort of set as a symbol. And since the worshipers and the priests that performed the worship these things only related to food and drink. We're talking about, there was food offerings and drink offerings, and then washing and regulations. Could the priest just come out of the field or doing whatever he wanted to and go into the holy place? Even the rank and file priests. What did they have to do? They had to do their preparation before they could go into worship. All right? So there was this is going back to that first part we talked about regulations. So, is there preparations that we as Christians need to do when we come to worship? Do we just walk in here and sit down and start worshiping God? Or do we make preparation to come to worship? Getting our mind in the right set, trying to clean our thoughts of worldly things, It might be hard maybe for Yancey saying, boy, I just got a call this morning for this air conditioner that's out, here, over here in Mount Pleasant. And is he sitting here thinking about replacing that air conditioner the whole time? What he tries to do is tries to remove that away from him. Brian, he's a police officer. Is he thinking about, I got to go to work tomorrow, and there's been it's a holiday weekend, and boy, there's a lot of stuff that happens on the holiday week. Is that where his focus is today? I'm a landscaper. It's going to rain this afternoon. Is it going to be too muddy for me to go out? Is that what we're thinking about here when we come together? That's what the writer's starting to, make a relation, to these people, getting them thinking. If the priests had to go through and do things to get ready to worship, what are we having to do? And then he goes through there, we start in verse 11, and he starts making a contrast. He says, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come. What were the good things to come?
I still falls in that same verse. The greater, more perfect tabernacle.
Okay, more perfect tabernacle.
Really, an entirely new system.
A new system.
Perfection.
Was there these blood sacrifices and different things that were going on that had to be done every year? All right. So, for the good things to come. And he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is saved not of this creation. So, what kind of contrast is he making between the tabernacle that he just described in the first, 6 to 9 verses, to this new one that he's telling these people that they have? What are some of the contrast differences between them? Where is the one? Or where was the one? Because it's not there anymore, right? What happened with the old one?
Jerusalem, was it not?
Destroyed along with Jerusalem. Could they reconstruct a tabernacle? You have the instructions, right? All right. What's the problem with reconstructing the tabernacle?
By God.
Well, not sanctioned by God. Well, that one was. And if they build it according to it, is it sanctioned by God? It's still a tabernacle, right? It's still done according to his plan. But there's another problem with it, right? What was the problem? The people who were designated to perform the services, you can't designate them anymore. There was a problem back in, Nehemiah and Ezra's time, that when some of these people came back from Babylon, that they couldn't trace their lineage. They couldn't serve as priests because why? Because they couldn't, significantly tell who they were. That lineage is gone. Once the Romans came in and destroyed all that, family history and things, and names and who begot who and things, a lot of that disappeared. So to get somebody that could enter that holy of holies anymore, you don't have anybody, right? So you have a tabernacle with nobody qualified to go in it. Where's your service? So he's talking about, Christ appeared. And he appeared as a high priest. And of the good things to come. And he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle. So how did he enter into that tabernacle? How did he enter into the Holy of Holy Places? He wasn't allowed really to go even into the holy place as, as a member of the tribe of Judah, right? So here he not only was able to go into the holy place, but he's also able to go into the Holy of Holies, all right? And how did he do that? And he didn't do it through, there in verse 12, it's not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. So what's being made as a reference here? If he had to do it by his own blood, where does your mind get drawn back to? When did Christ shed his blood? Did he come up and cut his finger and, oh, okay, here's the blood? Don't we use this passage a lot of times when we're partaking of these emblems here? We're remembering his death. We're remembering his sacrifice. Remembering that he shed his blood. That's what he's trying to remind these people of. He said that Christ appeared as a high priest of good things come, and he entered through the greater, not made with hands, as to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of good goats, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once for all, having attained eternal redemption. All right? So he makes a reference to eternal redemption. How did that, picture yourself as a Jew that went through, and he's talking about eternal redemption. What was this Day of Atonement, and what did it carry out? Good for a year, all right? And how did they work with this Day of Atonement? What was done? What were some of the regulations that went in it? What did they do?
They relied on high priest to go to the most holies.
Holy Holies. Also, what did they do with some of the blood?
Purified.
They sprinkled and purified it. What else did they do with some of the blood? What did they do for sin offerings? How you ever heard that term scapegoat? Huh?
They would release one of the goats, they would carry their sins
Carry their sins out.
out.
You didn't want that goat to come back, did you? All right? So, so there was a reminder that, yeah, their sins had been done, and that had been, put out of their sight, and they let it out to where they didn't want that goat to come back. All right? Because it was sort of an indication if it came back, what happened? Their sins came back with it, right? So they're talking about here about an eternal redemption. So they're talking about something that's better, right? Anybody what's your concept of eternal or infinite? Anybody study mathematics? If I put a dot here and a dot here, how many dots are in between there? Can you count them? What about here? Can you count them? What about here? As long as those two fingers aren't touching, there's little points between them. It's sort of called the concept of infinity. It goes from one place to another, and you can't count. That's sort of what eternal is. Eternal is something that has no ending. All right? So if your sins were under this new covenant, could they come back? And who did the offering? And where was that atonement made for? Can you see the contrast between that old covenant and that new covenant? And then it says, in verse 13, it says, "For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve a living God?" All right? Look at the contrast he made. What's he making the contrast between? The old and new? And animal blood and blood of Christ, all right? And the difference is, one was for the cleansing of the flesh, and the other one is how's he presenting us to God? There in verse 13. At verse 14, really.
It says the eternal spirit.
Through the eternal Spirit. And without blemish to God. So when Christ is presenting us to God through his blood, he's presenting us how? Without spot, without blemish, without anything. So God, doesn't see us with all our infirmities and all our things. How did, under the Old Testament and under the old law, how were those people, really, did that blood of bull and goats cleanse their conscience and their spirit? Scripture says it cleansed what? Their body. It was a temporary type thing. So then in verse 14 it says, how much more then the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve God. So he asks a question. He says, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, who's that himself? Christ. All right? And who did he offer himself to without blemish? God. And in doing so, he cleanses whose conscience? Ours. Okay. And what's he cleanses from? From dead works and to serve the living God. All right? So what's he doing? So he's saying, how much more will the blood of Christ do that? Have you comprehended that? Sort of a, question that you have to ask yourself, right? You have to look at this. Is if you're contrasting the old, how was my sins taken care of under the old law? And now under the new law, under the shedding of Christ's blood, how much more better is that? Does God accept that more than he accepted the old laws, the old way? And two, remember that word that we used back up there in about 6 through 10 there, that symbol, So it's it was something there. Have you ever built a model or designed car manufacturers, a lot of times they'll design a car and they'll build like a scale model of it before they put it in production. And they'll start looking at it and tune the design and everything. And they'll do it and then once they get that sort of figured out the way they want it, then they'll look at making a full-size vehicle out of it. All right? But that initial was just a symbol of what it was really going to be. And that's what we look at how God did that first tabernacle. He made it, he put it in this, but it was only a symbol of what was to come. And then verse 15, he says, and for this reason, he is a mediator of a new covenant. Now, the question is, what some of your other translations say about there in verse 15 when it reads about a covenant? Anybody have the Old King James? I guess Greg's the only one that uses it. I use New American Standard most of the time. I think, I probably I could get up on my phone and probably pull it up. I think some of them use Testament or, something like that, which sort of an indication of a will. And so it says, and for this reason, he's a mediator of a new covenant in order that since death has taken place for the redemption transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive promises of the eternal inheritance. And he brings in the word inheritance in there. And then it says, for where a covenant is, there also must be the necessity, be the death of the one who made it. When the first covenant was made, who died to bring it into existence? Did Moses die? Did Aaron die? Who died to bring that first one into existence? Or is there conflict here? Because it says, where a covenant is, there must be the necessity of the death of one who made it.
Maybe it was the spiritual death of Adam, because that kicked off this whole need for mediation and acceptance from God.
But the first covenant, it says, it had to come in existence with death. All right?
Did Adam die spiritually?
Huh?
Did Adam die spiritually when he sinned in the
He
garden?
did, but was the covenant in place when he died?
What's that?
Was the covenant in place when he died?
No, I'm saying it had to be in effect after that.
So it came into effect after that. But that was like, what, 1,800, 200, 2,000 years, 4,000 years, depending on how we kept time. So when did this first covenant come into place? Huh? Well, God made a covenant with Abraham, but is he talking about this covenant here? Or, are we getting, is covenant, inheritance, different things, we just getting sort of confused a little bit on words. Because it sounds like here, he talks about, that somebody had to die for a covenant to come into place. But we don't really see that under the, quote, the first testament or the, first covenant with the tabernacle and things. Or was that a different concept of the covenant that he's talking about over here? Because what he's talking about over here is sort of more like a will or a testament, right? If I devise a will, and probably a lot of us have one, I know I do, but there's stipulations in that will. When does that will come into play? Huh? When I die. All right? That's what he's talking about here in this thing. So for the one to get this second covenant to come into play, what had to happen? Death of Christ. All right? And that's what he's basically saying. He says, for where a covenant is, there of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. All right? So, while Christ lived, was his covenant in place? No. In fact, what did he tell his followers to do? Did they go to the temple and worship? Did they offer sacrifices? They did all that up until when? Till Pentecost. All right. So the other question is so when did Christ enter this new tabernacle? When he ascended on high, all right? So it comes through, and then he says, but then he goes through and he sort of starts giving us some insight into this first covenant. And he says there in verse 18, he says, for even the first covenant, and which one is he referring to? Is it the covenant with Abraham? Or is he talking about back to this covenant that God made with his people after he brought them out of the land of Egypt and established the law? All right. Maybe we read a little further and it'll give us the answer. For therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by who? By Moses. So that's starting to zero in on which covenant he's talking about, right? He's not going back to Adam. He's not going back to, to the patriarchs. He's not going back to Abraham. He's not going back to Isaac and to Jacob. But he said, for when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats and with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you. And in the same way, he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with blood. And according to the law, one must almost say, all things are cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. All right? So here the Hebrew writer went through, and basically he's taken out any shadow of death that it could have been the covenant made with Abraham, the offering of Abel, that he made that God was satisfied with. All those were things that God had talked to his people and instructed them with. But he's talking specifically about this old Jewish way of worship. And he's talking about the law of Moses and he's talking about how it was cleansed with blood. All right? So the death that took place were these animals that went through that did that cleansing. All right? And then he says there in verse for when the commandment had been spoken by Moses and all the people according to law, he took the blood of the calves and goats and water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you. And in the same way, he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels. And according to the law, one may almost say, all things are cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of the blood, there's no forgiveness. Therefore, it was necessary for what? What's he call those things? All that he talked about there in 19 or really basically 18 through 22, he talked about one particular thing, and he says, therefore it was necessary for copies of these things in heaven be cleansed with these things, but the heavenly things themselves with a better sacrifice than these. All right. So even though these goats and calves and everything were spotless, they had to meet certain requirements, they were sacrificed, their blood was presented, that was just a copy of something better, right? It was sort of a symbol of something that was to come. And that's what he goes through and talks about. And then he says that they were then for Christ, and then he goes through and talks about that in verse 24. For Christ did not enter the holy place made with hands. Christ didn't enter the tabernacle. He didn't go in there, it was just a mere copy of the true one. Where's he talking about where Christ entered? Heaven itself, right? But into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for who? Who is God there appearing before God, for us? I guess it's over. Did anybody ring the bell? I didn't hear it. Okay, second one ring too?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we'll finish up here, pick up 24 next week. I don't know where time went.